So we'll talk a little bit about managing data in one place because beyond collection, it's really, if we think about it, it's the way we organize and describe all of this data coming from the departments or the institutional records or from your research labs, but understanding that the context that we provide and the policies that we set up around the management of the data, we need to think about, who in fact can access the data. How do we share those clinical trials or those corporate documents? And then for how long do you keep that data? So it's more about policies than anything. And Matthew's going to talk about this in a few minutes, but we need to understand how to get that data into the system, get it into Perpetua, and then get it accessed to all of your shared end users. And so when we talk about proper management of the data and the policies that we need to get it in place, Perpetua really subscribes to these four tenets here: safeguarding, preserving, compliance, and discovery. And as we were kind of talking about a moment ago, safeguarding is ensuring that all of these multiple copies that exist in these multiple locations, whether it's on campus, whether it is across a particular country, whether it's across a particular state, or whether it's across a particular city. What happens when all of that critical data, even when you have multiple copies, is stored at either one location or it's at several locations, and then something challenges the ability to access the content at that location? Well, it could potentially be lost. Perpetua ensures that it's accessible from a backup perspective. It checks for viruses, it checks for encryption, it provides fixity checks too, which means that if something has altered the data, whether it's on ingest, whether maybe it was corrupted over time, Perpetua makes sure that it can be fixed and that it remains, perpetually, available. And then we look at preservation. So we need to address the problem of format obsolescence. So here we ask, what is the most preservable and the most usable format? We may convert a video file or an audio file or migrate a crucial hospital procedure from Word to PDFA, but we also need to understand that uses an open standard and addresses the best way to preserve the document, whether it's renormalizing it or guaranteeing its being accessible throughout its lifespan. We talk about compliance and access for the different formats. We still need to think about access. Perpetua offers, conversion of greater than 1,000 file formats, which again Matthew will talk about as well. But understand what is the most usable format to engage when the user discovers it. So maybe it's PowerPoint over to PDF for access purposes. And then really discovery, understanding that the metadata underneath it that is usable, that it's findable, that the metadata is aggressive enough so that when your end users are trying to retrieve content, that the metadata that's supported by Perpetua, whether it's grown by you, whether it's come along with the document itself, understands that discovery process is aggressive enough so you can find exactly what you're looking for, so you don't have to go looking for 45 minutes for a particular piece of data. And that's really what I want to focus on, is that last portion before I turn it over to Matthew, is understanding how is this data brought to life. How is it made usable? How do we bring this together in all of those disparate locations? Understand that it's searchable, that it's browsable, and then you have your choice of discovery platform. So here we have a user interface with using Stacks as a content management system and EBSCO Discovery Service Health as its discovery service. And the flexibility of the user interface itself is so that it's tailored for each individual hospital, each individual college or university, each individual corporation, or what have you. But the flexibility of it is such that if we search cytotoxicity, yes, we can absolutely search the entire information ecosystem of the particular organization, but also the flexibility in its UX is such is that searching the ecosystem, searching the individual journals, searching the point of care, or searching Perpetua as an individual piece of content is allowable now through this information ecosystem that you are providing for your end users. So if we search cytotoxicity and we bring up the result list, what we've done here with Stacks is brought in Perpetua so that you have access to not only the other pieces of content to which your organization subscribes or purchases throughout that ecosystem, but they're also well defined by individual bento boxes. And the strength of Perpetua, and this doesn't have to be defined as Perpetua necessarily, it could be defined as the Oliver White Institutional Archive. The flexibility of it is such is that because of the strength of all of its metadata, because they preserve all of those compliance and regulatory agreements underneath it, allows for the discovery of it inside of here, understanding that that end user can get access to it. The metadata is displayed inside of the result itself, and when the associated image is inside of the document itself, we're able to bring it to life onto the result list so that end user can see a quick preview of what this particular document is all about. So if we look at it, we go into the full record itself, we see the access version of the content that's really kind of pushed to that front end of the system. On the left here, on the left at the top, what you see is the drop-down indexing of all of the relevant documents to this particular document itself coming from your search. Below it, you can see thumbnail versions of all the content, and if it's multiple pages, you can see the carousel that is associated with it as well. On the right, you have the ability to navigate the individual collection for specific items to view. You have the full clinical policy that has been converted automatically to PDF so it can be easily viewed online. But it doesn't have to necessarily be clinical trials or policies and procedures. In the case of like an email, so now emails can be brought into the system, and emails with attachments, and you don't necessarily have to have any email software because of the strength of Perpetua, now this content can be brought in, and it's really much more excitingly complex. So on the left, again, what you have is a PST email archive that's been converted over to both Mbox and EML, but the attachments have been extracted. And then the PST has been brought into a hierarchical set of folders with all of the emails you see there on the left with the carousel viewable using the PDF. The great part of this is that previously, because there was no bake-off data set that was converted over into a carousel, what Archivum has done with Perpetua allows for not only that serendipitous, but also for that precise discovery of pieces of content like this, that heretofore were really not findable or were findable via a cumbersome way. Now it's all brought in and it's all compliant with your HIPAA regulations or your GDPR regulations or any number of other different regulations, which George will discuss in detail in a few minutes. And here is the email attachment with the PowerPoint embedded in it. So it's been extracted, it's been normalized. This premise presentation has been pulled from one of these emails that might have been sitting in the email server prior to this, having it now brought to be easily accessible via a discovery service. Both the parent email, its attachments, and all of the child emails from that are now fully indexed, and they can be searched alongside with other metadata coming from your journals or your data sets or your other repositories. So as I begin to wrap up and pass it over to Matthew, we just realized that as partners, Archivum and EBSCO, that security threats are not slowing down anytime soon. What Perpetua is doing here, and what you're going to see in greater detail with the two gentlemen that will be presenting next, they really offer an unprecedented opportunity for the organization to achieve this distinct advantage that has not been made available before. So as senior leaders in your hospital, as senior leaders at your university, at your corporation, we also want to make sure and support you and your organization's responsibility to not only consume the data, but also safeguard it. We want to make sure that you preserve it, and consolidate it, and ensure compliance for, and then really discover the data. Not only the content that is produced or purchased outside of the hospital, outside of the organization, but also the content that your organization generates, that your organization produces, whether it's in-house writing of doctor's theses, whether it is training videos, whether it is 3D objects, whatever that is. Perpetua offers the flexibility of having this content ingested inside of here. And then because you have worked with EBSCO in any number of different ways, you can now continue to work with the vendor that you already know and trust. It avoids the sometimes complicated onboarding of a new vendor. You can achieve attractive pricing through packaging with your current EBSCO content. And then there's seamless integration with all the other content to which the organization, the hospital, the university subscribes and purchases because of the content management system that could be provided as well. So having all of this understands that you're going to now be able to build relationships with the users of that entire information ecosystem, who's your key audience. You'll be able to position your brand or your department as the organization's leader, ensuring that long-term you are understanding and you're acknowledging to the larger organization that you're compliant, that you're making sure all of this content is preserved, not just for next year, but for 20, 30, 40 years from now. Understanding that your end users, our end users, are going to be able to get access to this content. I'm going to switch it over to Matthew.
Great, thank you, Tim. Hello, I'm Matthew Addis from Archivum, and I'm going to talk for the next 20 minutes about approaches you can take to long-term data management and medical content. So let me just screen. Slide. So there we go. Okay. So what I'm going to do is start by briefly reviewing the requirements that apply to a wide range of content types that Tim already mentioned. I'll argue that these requirements can be addressed using a combination of digital preservation and risk management techniques. I'll then talk about the use of all the existing good practice guidelines and standards that are out there and can be applied. And during that, I'll focus quite a bit on digital preservation, because I guess that's probably new to some of you. And as I go along, I'll tie these into the main themes of the webinar, so you'll see the importance and benefits of consolidating data, achieving compliance, managing costs, and delivering long-term access. So if we start with some of the underlying requirements for long-term retention and access to medical content, well, for clinical data, it could be digital content that's being generated during patient care, so diagnostics or treatments, or it could be digital content from clinical trials of a new drug taking place at a hospital. And these requirements will vary depending on the specific type of content, but they actually have a lot in common. And I'm using Alcoa here as an example, and this features in requirements from various bodies who govern and regulate clinical trials. And the requirements revolve around making sure that retained data is accurate and complete, and it continues to be accessible and usable well into the future, for example, for the lifetime that a drug is on market. And Alcoa includes investigation sites of hospitals as well as CROs and sponsors. And along with things like Alcoa, there are often associated requirements that an organization So, for example, having an identified individual responsible for making this happen, so a designated archivist. Meeting requirements for privacy and security, such as HIPAA, and using risk management to ensure the approach taken is proportionate to the importance of the content being made. And often that all has to be done in a way that could be validated and audited. For non-clinical data, so academic research, for example, that might be done in a medical institution, medical data, requirements are less about regulatory compliance, more about making sure the results of the research can be trusted and used. And the underlying drivers here are for high quality research that follows good research practice, and that the results of the research are repeatable and verifiable. And that also has to be done in a way that ensures data is safe and secure, especially when it's and those requirements come all the way from the top down, for example, from the age statements way back in 2013, through to funding body requirements and data management plans, or the principles of making data findable. Beyond clinical or research data, there are probably more general requirements that you might need to respect. For example, GDPR, content contains personally identified information. GDPR is well known for the requirements that data must be collected and retained with consent, and it has to be protected against breaches. However, GDPR also requires that data shouldn't be lost, and it has to be in a form that's portable, that can be transferred in a way that's understandable and usable, and that it can be accessed and used when requested by data subjects. So that means GDPR and regulations like HIPAA for personal data and have many of the same requirements that we've seen for clinical. And if you put those requirements together, I think three things emerge. So the need for information security, to make sure data is protected, be accessed by authorized individuals, digital preservation, to make sure that data remains accessible over the long term, and then risk management, so the approach is proportionate to the consequences of the loss, disclosed, or couldn't be. So how do you address those three things? Well, I'll argue that a common solution is possible with four main dimensions. Firstly, it needs to follow good digital preservation practice as a foundation for making content accessible and usable in the future. Secondly, data is consolidated into a single platform for data management, and that addresses risks and costs. That the platform automates long-term data management, and that helps ensure policies and procedures are properly enforced. And finally, that platform for data management is integrated into your environment. As Tim said, it's easy to get content in that needs to be protected, but it's also easy to get it back out again when you need it. So let's explore some of those four areas in a bit more detail, and I'll start with digital preservation. So for those of you not familiar with digital preservation, it's the full set of activities necessary to ensure digital content remains accessible and usable over time. And as a discipline, it's been developed and applied for several decades now, especially by memory institutions and libraries and archives, as well as in research and industry. So for example, in the US, the Library of Congress, NARA, NASA have all been or are examples of organizations taking leading roles in the development and application of digital preservation techniques. And those digital preservation techniques are ongoing activities. Digital preservation is not a one-shot process. Digital content needs continual intervention to keep it alive and accessible. And that continuing cycle of intervention and digital preservation is illustrated here in the Digital Curation Centre's lifecycle model. So that's one resource I'll highlight if you want to understand all the things you could or should be doing as part of your long data lifecycle management. And this diagram shows just some of the things that could happen over 20 years of applying that lifecycle to your. So in this picture, a change from blue to yellow is when something happens, old or managed. So if we work from the top down, might be adding or accessing content on a daily basis. That's a continual process. Systems need monitoring and maintenance, monthly checks and updates. Data integrity needs to be verified, for example, annual retrievals and integrity tests. As Tim mentioned, hardware and software becomes obsolete, so needs refreshing and upgrading. Formats of data may need to change because of software obsolescence. And then there's the need to manage things like staff transitions and even suppliers of products and services will come and go. So that all needs to be managed too. The point is that the lifetime of data is longer than the lifetime of almost everything that's used to keep that data safe and accessible. And there's always something going on, some sort of change that happens, and there's always a risk that something goes wrong. And there's always a need to validate that when you've changed things, that it's been affected properly. That requires time and expertise and money. But then if you don't do it, and you don't perform preservation, there's the risk that content will be lost, or it will degrade, or it can't be found in. So that means risk management is also an inherent part of digital preservation. And the diagram here is from the risk-based approach used at the National Archives in the UK. And this sort of risk-based approach fits very well with the requirements for risk management for clinical or other forms of regulated medicine.
Sorry, Matthew, can I interrupt for a sec?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. You're sounding a little fuzzy, so if you could just...
Am I?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, is that a bit better?
Yeah, that sounds better.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that. And indeed, risk-based approaches to digital preservation form part of some of the key standards developed by the digital preservation community. So ISO 16363 for trusted digital repositories, Rambora. And those standards are worth a look when you're thinking about the risks that you might face for your content in the long term. And those sort of risk assessment approaches are just one example of a range of guidelines and good practice that are out there for digital preservation. And I've shown a few more here, for example, based on maturity models. And they're great because digital preservation, it's really important to get the basics in place first before looking to apply sophisticated techniques. And indeed, there's a danger that organizations think that digital preservation is too complicated and they delay doing anything. And that's often the worst thing that you can do. The content doesn't look after itself. So to give you one example, the Digital Preservation Coalition has provided their rapid assessment model, and that describes a series of service capabilities for the practical things you can do for safeguarding, preservation, managing metadata, and making content. And there's a whole load of activities it covers, and they're all important for long-term data management of medical. So I'd encourage you to look at the RAM model to see where your organization is at the moment and use it to determine where you need to be going forward. And then following good practice also includes making decisions on what to do with that content. So as Tim mentioned, converting it into formats that are better suited for access or preservation. And that's called file format normalization, which is actually quite a complex topic. But for now, you might want to look at NARA's new guidelines on preferred file formats. So that covers a range of different content types, including images, video, documents, email, web databases, and so on. And that might help you understand what you might need to do in terms of normalizing your files into a preferred format based on NARA's risk assessment. Again, this is an example of how digital preservation ties in with risk management. So all this sounds great, but when do you actually do all this digital preservation? So it's really hard to manage content over the long term when it's live and held in a wide range of content-specific apps and environments, which can be all too common, for example, in a hospital environment. So the approach is to get content from that live environment into a safe place where it can be properly safeguarded and managed. And it could be a copy of the data while it's still live, or it could be archiving data that's been finished with and needs to be retained. And if you get that data into a long-term data management environment, and you do it as soon as you can, then at least you have a consolidated version of record in a safe place. And there are lots of good reasons for doing that. For example, you've got the content protected, and that helps with disaster recovery. It's easier to provide long-term access because the data's all in one place. You've got a dedicated place to do the digital preservation. You can check that you're holding the data you should do. You've got a reference version of content that's definitive and it's locked down and auditable. And demonstrate that you have a system that explicitly supports the compliance requirements. You can have named individuals responsible for archiving who use the system, and you can more easily cope with audits and inspections. There are lots of good reasons for consolidating data into a single platform. And as George will talk about after me, that's exactly what we do in Perpetua. There's a single place to consolidate data from multiple sources and get it under long-term management. And that approach of consolidating data into a dedicated environment isn't a new one. It's what the Open Archive Information System standards, that's OIS, says to do. If you don't know OIS, then it originated from the Consultative Committee of Space Data Systems led by NASA, and since then OIS has become a major and widely adopted ISO specification in the digital preservation community. And it provides a framework for long-term retention and access to digital content. And that framework includes, as Tim mentioned, archival storage, which is about safeguarding data, and there's plenty of good practice. So making multiple copies of the data and storing them in different locations and actively managing those copies. And if you want to assess solutions for data safeguarding, then have a look at the preservation storage criteria. That's a great resource on what to look for in a data safeguarding product or service. And I actually did a whole webinar on this last year, so if you'd like the recording, then please get in touch. And indeed, that's exactly what we do in Perpetua. So we have a comprehensive approach to data safeguarding, and that includes making multiple copies of content, storing them in different geographic locations, and regularly checking fixes. And that enables our contractual guarantee of data integrity backed by indemnity insurance. And we can deliver solid exit plans, including data escrow, through our use of open standards and no vendor. Again, George will talk a bit more about that in a minute. And as an added bonus, that sort of data safeguarding approach is great for dealing against, or guarding against threats, including things like ransomware. So if you're hit by ransomware, and maybe you're locked out of your online system or have no access to your data, you could try paying the ransom or disinfecting the system, or you could try restoring from backup. That hasn't also been effective, or indeed if you backed up properly in the first place. But of course, if you've got a separate safeguarded copy of the data and associated records in a long-term data management environment, then you're in a much better position to recover. So far, I've covered some of the good practice that needs to be implemented and how to put that into a long-term data management environment where you consolidate and manage your data. But all those activities can still take time and effort. And that's where automation is important, about using software systems to automate digital preservation activities, especially if you have a limited staff or budget. So if you're using automation, then it means using software tools. And there's quite a lot of digital preservation software tools out there, and Copter is a community resource that you can use to discover some of them. And you can then look at activities in the digital preservation lifecycle that I showed at the beginning, work out what level of maturity you want to achieve, and then find tools to use it. But I'd emphasize there are no tools that cover all stages of digital preservation or all the content types you probably have. So if you are going to build your own digital preservation infrastructure, then there's plenty of work still needed. And that, of course, is what Perpetua does for you. We do all of that hard work in our solution. And for organizations of medical content, if you are going to use a long-term data management platform, maybe using some of the tools in Copter, then will you be able to show it meets compliance requirements? So, for example, long-term data management systems used for clinical trials data are computerized systems and they need to be validated. That takes a lot of work, and know that firsthand at Archivum, because we've got ISO 9001 certification, and we've been audited by customers in life sciences and medical sectors for GDPR compliance. So combining all those tools and techniques together into a validated and enterprise-grade solution that have end-to-end workflows takes a lot of effort. And this diagram shows some of the workflows you might need. So there are sources of content on the left, labs, diagnostics, reference materials, search publications, so on. And there are people who need to use that content in the future in a range of different applications and purposes on the right. And in the middle, long-term data management environments such as Perpetua ensure that that content left is available to those who need to use it on the right in a way that conforms to compliance requirements, automates workflows, and indeed, the challenge with that is that the producers and consumers of the content may be separated by 5, 10, 20 years or more. This is where integrations are really important. Integrations help get content into the long-term data management environment in a form that's complete and correct. You know you have everything you need. And integrations help get it back out again when you need it. And that's exactly why we integrate Perpetua with Stacks, for example. The content's easily discoverable and accessible. And the integrations you need are going to depend on exactly what sort of content and applications you have. So you need a flexible solution. So I'm going to sort of stop there. I've talked about the requirements for long-term data management, the application of good practice, especially digital preservation, why it's important to consolidate data into a long-term data management environment, and then use automation. So having done that, I think it's probably now is a good time to hand over to George. Oops. Right. Screen, and then I'll let George over. Presenter and talk to you a bit more about the solution.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Great, thanks again, Matthew, and thanks, Tim, as well, for those introductions. My name is George Waddell, Global Vice President of Life Sciences for Archivum, and I'll spend just a few minutes talking a little bit more about Archivum's solution, our approach for long-term data management, and then I'll wrap up with just a few kind of use cases and samples of how some of our clients have used Archivum in their scenarios for the biomedical arena. So as it's come up quite a few times in the earlier presentations, we look at the three core pillars of Archivum as I have on the screen. It all starts with being able to meet the regulations as well as be able to adjust to new regulations as they come out, as those are rapidly changing throughout the life cycle of your data. So new regulations like GDPR was something that wasn't really envisioned early when some of this data was created and first put into digital format. So being able to manage that through not just the regulations need to be met today, but also those regulations that may be on the radar or something that's a little further off the radar that has to be brought into your long-term strategy for this content. We then also want to optimize the value of this data. So when we look at content, we don't look at it as an archive as something sitting on a dusty shelf somewhere. We look at the ability for you to be able to find that content, be able to access it quickly, and also collaborate and work on it within your teams or potentially even external sources to share it across systems. And then finally, to be able to cost effectively manage that data growth. From that perspective, it is in the number of systems you're managing, the way and the method for you to find that content, the amount of time it may take you to do that, And again, we often find scenarios where our clients have multiple systems that they're trying to scan or go across to be able to find their content throughout their ecosystem. Being able to condense that can save licensing costs at times, as well as the efforts for overhead and management and maintenance of those systems. Before getting into a little bit more detail on some of the solution and the functionality of it, just a quick view here on our install base across the overall medical spectrum. We do have customers and clients using from early research, basic kind of discovery, all the way through R&D and development of the products, and then into healthcare delivery within hospital systems. So ranging everywhere from medical academic research, other research institutes, sponsors, CROs, and hospitals, all using Archivum for the basic core principles that I've just outlined. So when we start with the solution, we start with those core principles, really taking this from the left-hand side. The first and most important thing is to make sure that data is in compliance. And by doing this, making sure that there is a full record and full view of everything that's happened to this content, full audit trails as it's been migrated or moved from system to system, and make sure as well that it is controlled in a secure environment with audit trails, and again can be recalled as needed when an inquiry should come in. Once we have it in compliance, we look at the next two, and they kind of go a little bit hand in hand, the organization being in control and data sources being consolidated. By having it control, we do often see organizations that have it spread across multiple systems. They may even have it spread across multiple vendors, specifically having things with CROs or other affiliated partners. By being able to bring it into a consolidated source, now having one location or one place for that content to be accessed and utilized. If it is consolidated, I continue moving down this chain to make sure that then I can now find the content and make it usable and collaboration ready. That is a little bit along the lines of digital preservation, being able to make sure that when I want to open and utilize that content, it is available and it does fit into the right model with it. Additionally, be able to share it both within and outside the organization through a secure workflow and a process of requesting the content and someone approving and granting access to that content, all with full compliance and traceability to know that that process has been run through and identify who it's been shared with and when. And then finally, we've already talked a little bit about the cost optimization components. Again, being able to identify systems that may be able to be end of life. Maybe there's components that can be turned off and streamlined, or reduction in licensing on other systems that are no longer used for active collection of data and content. So we've seen this picture on the bottom of the screen a few times throughout the presentations today, and here really want to just bring that together. And the idea of what we're doing in our approach is breaking down those silos, taking content from multiple sources. This can be lab instruments or research instruments. This could be other systems. It could be corporate documents or systems that still need traceability, such as email communications with regulatory bodies. All of those can be brought into one location. It can also span and bring in information and data from external systems. So by bringing those all together, we're able to then integrate this and unify it, focus on the type of content that's there and the need to be able to reuse it and access it easily. I've already mentioned the idea in the content now being open and modular, updating the proper formats so that you can reduce dependency on potential proprietary formats that may have been used when the content was originally created. And be able to do it automatically. So that is a key value here, that you're not kind of manually going through and looking at this or manually trying to export it, that we can bring this all into one location through automated processes. So diving a little further and a little deeper then into those core components, and if we look at those three pillars and align those, the first one is the data safeguarding. And so Archivum can offer 100% data integrity guarantee, not a bit lost. It can always be found, and we will make sure that there is no corruption, no problems, no issues with the data that you're trying to maintain over its entire life cycle. Through that, then, on the compliance factor is making sure that it has secure access, audit trails, full chain of custody, and full metadata that aligns with the data that you're keeping. And these two categories really now come into the act of, if there was an inquiry, if there was an investigation, the ability to produce the content that you need to produce, show the way that the data was handled properly and securely throughout its entire life cycle. From there, in optimizing the data and optimizing the value of the data, applies the usability of it. So this is our capability to index it and extract information from the content that's coming in. So being able to search on metadata that is generated at the time when the content is created. It could also then be enhanced or actually search into the content itself. So that gives you a much greater range of being able to find a content based on the search and the search criteria that you're utilizing. And of course, then once you can find it, you can begin to collaborate. So who is allowed to access this? How are they allowed to access it? And what's that process? And being able to share it very easily through the front end with Archivum. And as Tim showed earlier, the idea that through that search, being able to find the information in line with the other searches and other materials that you have from EBSCO. And then finally, what we can do around the cost optimization, from centralizing data, reducing the overhead on other systems, potentially shutting down old systems that are, again, maybe just sitting around only because there's some old data that needs to be accessed from time to time in it. So optimize those, and also optimize storage costs based on usage and location. And then finally, as part of the cost optimization, is digital preservation. And this one really comes out, it comes out in multiple of these channels, of course, but it does really fit here as well from the perspective of how long would it take you to access or find or open an old file that is no longer in a supported format? What other systems need to be maintained because a file or content is in an old format? So it does, again, fit in multiple places, but this is also a good category for it to fall. We've talked a lot about the different, regulations that will apply. I'm not going to go into each and every one of these. I'm happy to have a conversation about how Archivum can fit in to your specific regulations, how we've approached these, and how we meet all of these. But and there are some, depending on localities, that are specific for your area. Put into perspective in the way that Archivum is designed, it is built to serve the regulated market. So we have accomplished all of these great things and met all of these regulations there. There will be more, and there will be more for us to update, as always, but it is our goal and it is our mission with our software to be able to meet and serve the regulated market. So the additional approach with our solution and the way we look at long-term data management is it's not a one-time stop. This isn't once that you go through and you take your file and you go through preservation, you move it from format A to B. It is ongoing because, as I've already mentioned, the regulations will change and evolve. Systems will also change and evolve, and things will go through end of life and need to be migrated and moved. So we look at this and the value that we provide as part of a managed service. So ongoing management and maintenance for the regulations, for the data types that are out there, and ensuring constantly and continuously that the data is looked after, is preserved, and is available, whether it needs to be accessed in the next 6 months, 6 years, or 60 years, maintaining it through that entire process. So just a few areas that we typically see our clients looking for, and this really does come back in alignment with the other slides that I've covered. But the first is to unify their data, break down the silos, put data in one location, and be able to then ease the ability to find the content and then extend the access and collaboration to that. And also know that there's a single source of truth as that content's being accessed. It's one spot to look, knowing that you've got the right information. We typically see it being focused on regulated data to meet those data retention requirements. It is compliant, secure, and audited. And this can be any type of data. It could be patient records. It could be subject information. It could be data that's being collected through research and development coming directly off of lab equipment or from clinical trials and subject information coming back. And then finally, we also do see applications and system end of life. So there are systems that are being shut down or migrated from an old system to a new one to streamline that, or potentially reduce the data migration from system A to system B by trying to map up or match inflexible systems with the metadata or capabilities that they may have than simply putting into Archivum to be able to store that for long-term access. So just a few case studies. I'm going to move very quickly through these. I'm looking at the time here, and I'll make sure we have time for a couple questions. If you haven't put in questions already, it's a great time to add them into the question panel. So I'm happy to review these if there's any more specific questions on these with anyone one-on-one in more detail. So for Oxford Molecular Diagnostics, they're part of Oxford University Hospitals. Essentially, what they're looking to do, and part of the requirements, is that their clinical services and research are generating and need to store genomic data. And that becomes part of the patient record and requires a 30-year retention period. So they have a lot of samples, they're of a large size, and they also want a rapid retrieval of them. And so they deployed Archivum to ensure that their data was easily accessible and could be shared, but could be shared according to their guidelines and track that it was being shared with their 30 plus or minus scientists and clinicians who needed to access the data. Another partner of ours, Flex Global, they're an eTMF provider, and they provide both services and solutions. Through our partnership, they're providing Archivum's archival services for eTMFs, part of the electronic trial master file for clinical studies. And essentially, it again has a very long retention period of 25 plus years. And they need to ensure, and their clients need to be able to ensure, that the content from the eTMF is inspection ready. So if a regulator should show up, that they can be able to show a complete and controlled environment for their eTMF archives. And they also have 100% data integrity guarantee with that. Again, no bit lost through the duration of the retention period. And the final one here that I'll review is Bristol Genetics Laboratory. They were a newly created laboratory as part of Bristol Southmead NHS hospitals. They're generating about 15 terabytes a year of NGS, next generation sequencing data, per year. The two big components that they had is that they needed to run within the NHS network. And so Archivum was able to provide them with the flexibility to work within their own network for the storage of data. So it wasn't required that it had to be with a certain provider for the long-term storage. And then additionally, the integration with their tools to automate the process as the NGS data is being collected and being passed over to Archivum was all done automatically. So being able to instantly have that data accessible and located in one location was a big value for them. So just to summarize, I know we're right at the top of the hour here. So again, unify the data, open a module to share it, manage it through the entire life cycle, and do it in an automated fashion. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kim for the questions that we may have sitting waiting for us.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. And George. Thanks, guys, for all that information. That was great. Let's throw in one question since the time is so late. How does Archivum integrate with other data analytic applications such as Tableau, RScript, SAS, and etc.?
Why don't I take that one? So there are multiple ways in which you could put data analytics of the solution. So for example, we provide a REST API, so you can search for content in Perpetua. That also supports things like metadata harvesting. So that would be a way to integrate analytics applications on top of Perpetua where they need to access descriptive metadata, technical metadata, events that have happened, the audit log we produce, and so on. Perpetua also allows metadata information to be exported in multiple formats, so CSV or XML or JSON, so then you can export from Perpetua and import analytics environments. And then internally, we also use Elasticsearch for the indexing that we do. In turn means that like Kibana on the top, which is a visualization and analytics tool. We don't do that currently, but because we use it, it's possible. And then finally, through our whole sort of microservices-based architecture. We already integrate with Prometheus, which is a sort of a way of processing real-time metrics into sort of. So yeah, lots of different options.
Okay, great. All right, I think we will let everybody go, but I just want to thank everybody, and we will send a link to the recording. And have a great day, everybody.